helicopter broke down in a little village in Mali, and I talked to a man with his wife and children. He told me about his wife. These people work every day with their hands to feed their family. They're afraid of diseases because if they're ill, they can't feed their family anymore. They fear the weather, and they killed a goat for me. They looked at me straight in the eyes and trusted me and told me about their lives. Because in my documentary, The Earth from the Sky, what I was missing was what people were saying. I knew all this, but hearing it, it's different. It goes straight to your heart. And I became less stupid after these 3 days, and I decided to film people and make pictures, and I sent people to shoot a video which is called 6 billion hosts or guests. You might have seen the exhibition at Grand Palais in Paris. And then I thought about making this film, Human, and then my life was all about running after the beauty of the world. And now I think that the beauty of people is much more interesting. In the ecological problems of today, we need to look at the beauty of what we are going to do, the beauty of sharing, the beauty of fighting poverty, and this seems to me much more beautiful. And in everything I do today, I try to let others express themselves. So this film is called Women. We came up with it with Anastasia Mikova. For those of you who've seen Women in the audience, how many of you have seen it? It's a wonderful film. It's free of charge on YouTube. Anastasia did 600 interviews, and we decided to make this film together. And there were 18 women in a team of boys, of men, and they took power. And I didn't want to talk about menstruation, and they said, yes, you have to talk about menstruation. We bleed every month. It's crucial to speak about it, and something I had not understood. I realized that women have much more difficult things to overcome than men during their lives. And this film changed my life, my views about my mother, my wife, my sisters. And I'm moved because maybe I did not love my mother enough. And I would like to tell her I love her, and I sent her a big kiss. So you were explaining that this documentary changed you. What really impressed you the most amongst all these testimonies? Well, I wanted to talk about injustice with Anastasia. Why 80% of the poorest people are women? Why amongst the illiterate 80% are women? Why do women, 50% of the women work the soil and only hold 2% of the land of the world? Why is there only 2 to 3% of women in prisons and the rest are men? I wanted to talk about injustice, and Anastasia brought a more intimate view, sexuality, the body, adolescence. In the film, there's a young girl, she's 14, she explains that when her body changes, she's embarrassed, and there were students there, and they said, it's the first time that in a film you are talking about that moment when we are embarrassed, that our body is changing, that everybody is looking at you, and it's thanks to Anastasia that we did that. All these women made the film much more than myself, and I thought it's their film. Of course, I'm not easygoing, so sometimes I was criticizing, but I understood that my place was to just look and let them do what they wanted, which is not at all the kind of person I am, but I understood that I was not in my right place. I'm a boy. I was raised by a very authoritarian father. My mother was doing everything. I was raised in this tradition where men control everything, but after all, I have the feeling that my mother raised me and made me what I am today, and I want to tell her that today. I'm very moved because I couldn't tell her before she died. So it's a very moving documentary, and it's a lot about violence, not only about violence. Of course, when you interview women who have been raped with knives in Congo, when you talk with women from the Sudan who have been filmed, it's the end of the film because afterwards we couldn't do anything more. But it's not only a film about violence only. What's great is that when we show the film, when there's a viewing, women come and see me and tell me I feel that I'm one with all these women. Women feel closer after seeing the film. They share this. It's common to them, and it's a little foreign to us. Now, you know, all militants for the environment, all activists or heroines are women, Greta, etc. So they have a more intelligent vision of the future than men. So this really affected me. I realized that all these heroines were women. All these heroines of the environment were women. And you said that it was quite easy to make them talk. They wanted to talk. If I say, okay, I have a studio to help me, and I'm going to do interviews. These interviews are very long, 1 hour, an hour and a half in the dark, with a light in front of you. It's very intimate. And at the end of the conference, the women want to be interviewed. Men don't do that. They don't want to talk about their intimate life, their private life, but women want. After a while, the women, they speak for themselves. They don't speak to you anymore. They say things that they've never said, and it shows their generosity. I wanted to make a film about men, but men don't want to talk about all these things. Men, when we talk about sex, we're pigs. Women, when they speak about sex, they're funny. They're very funny. They're not dirty at all. They're just normal. And as a man, I was very much surprised with this incredible freedom. I don't know whether women talk about sex with one another, but we men don't do it, never. We never talk about sex. And I was really struck by this incredible liberty. But there are many more things in the film. So they had a lot to say, but no platform to say it. Well, Me Too changed everything. Now you go anywhere in the world, and a woman from Madagascar, for instance, well, what changed with cell phones and the web? Women are aware of everything. They know everything. It changed the world. It's the greatest revolution of our era. It's not cars flying in the streets. You know, it's communication. And Me Too, the fact that women throughout the world are revolting, rebelling, and talking, this has freed the women. And what surprised me is that women who had been abused and raped were ashamed to talk about it. They didn't dare to talk about it. And I remember a film show, when I was showing the film, a woman stood up and she said, I was raped when I was 15 or 20. And I want to say it tonight. It's very moving. You have encounters like that, and there is a shame which is unbearable. But today I think that women feel much freer to speak much more than before. And you felt this during the shooting of the film. I can't hear with the rain. So you were saying that when you shot Human, you felt that. Well, I didn't do any interview during this film. It was female journalists with women technicians, and the editing was done by women as well. I was just looking at the rushes. But I saw deep down that it was not the role of a man to ask those questions. They are difficult questions. You spend 1 hour and a half, you speak in the dark, and women start saying things that they've never said. And we realized when we did Human that women wanted to talk. We had already understood that we wanted to do a film about women exclusively, but we kept strong moments for the next film that we did not include in Human willingly. Well, thank you, because without knowing it, you proposed a wonderful transition with our next roundtable. You talked about the need of women to talk, to support them in freeing their speech, and in spite of that, they are still largely absent from peace negotiations. You know, when women are part of the negotiators, the process has 30% more chances of succeeding. We'll talk about this. We'll see an extract of the documentary later on. But now I'd like to invite Florence Besson to come back to the stage to moderate the first roundtable. And in between, while everybody is going up and down the stage, I'd like you to see a short video from INA, a series of portraits of women who have fought for peace. And this episode is dedicated to Linda Benguigui, the Tunisian blogger. And if you are in Paris this weekend or next weekend, ELLE and the Good Planet Foundation are organizing a debate on women. It's free of charge and it's open to all. You are very welcome if you want to go. Thank you.
Blogueuse prise dans la marche de l'histoire, Lina...
A blogger caught by history, Lina Benguigui told about the revolution in Tunisia and became one of the faces of the Arab Spring. Well, she died in 2020 at the age of 36, and this accessible cyber activist close to people used the internet to federate youth that was rebelling and revolting. We have to recognize that cyber activism is a movement that can change and improve situation. Everything started from a blog. She was coming back from 1 year of studies in the United States, and she was telling people about her nights in a nightclub in Tunis. But the world started changing. She said, I came and everybody was revolting. Her father was an opponent to Bourguiba, and Lina wanted to express her exasperation. So her blog became political and started the movement of May 22, 2010. So you decided to organize a peaceful demonstration in Tunis. Yes, demonstration against censorship on the internet. The Tunisian revolution started a few months later when in December a young fruit vendor was really falling into despair. Okay, I filmed videos and shared them on YouTube and my blog. The interpreter is sorry, she can only sum up. Now, young people are fed up in front of this inequalitarian and corrupt society. And her blog, Tunisian Girl, goes around the world. When I started blogging, it was to express the concerns of my compatriots, to say no to dictatorship and no to the limitation of freedoms in my country. I was not expecting any prizes or to be nominated to the Nobel Prize. If Lina was so successful, it's because her culture is the culture of internet and her message is international. When Ben Ali fled, it was partly her victory. Well, in Tunisia, if we had not used the internet, there would have been more dead and more bloodshed, and it's very important. She's very modest. She knows it's only the beginning. Now, the leaving of Ben Ali was only a small step. Now the situation of the media in Tunisia is not really changing. We don't really have an independent justice. There is still a political police. It still uses violence. There's still a lot to do. Now she's on the list for the Peace Nobel Prize, but she stays in her country and is subject to intimidation. But she remains free. Can you give us one positive point in Ben Ali's policies? No, nothing. She's the spokesman of a secular generation, a modern one, in favor of sex equality, of gender equality. And Leila Ben-Meni really fought in favor of the freedom of expression and artistic freedom as well. In January 2020, the voice of Lina Ben-Meni stopped, but the bridge that she built between the young of Tunisia and the rest of the world survives her passing away. So welcome to this first conference dedicated to our cycle about women in conflicts. We will talk about women in peace processes, or rather the role that they don't have, their unseekable absence. 70% of non-combatant victims in recent conflicts are women and children. 500,000 women were raped in Rwanda during the genocide in 1994. In the year 2000, the UN adopted Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, which aimed at putting women in the light and giving them access to decision-making processes. 20 years later, women are still invisible in peace processes. In the 20 past years, only 5% of the signatories of peace processes were women, only 2% of mediators and 5% of the witnesses, only 0.2% of bilateral aid dedicated to situations of conflict or after conflicts are given to women associations. It's a scandal, even more so because women are there in the field. They fight to make their voices heard. They fight for peace. They are and we have with us to talk about the role of women in the peace processes, and we have the immense honor to host Betty Oyela Bigombe, mediator, ex-director of the World Bank for vulnerabilities during conflicts, and we also have Aja Shayet, activist and full-time survivor, as she defines herself, who founded the NGO Together We Build It following the war in Tunisia in 2011, an NGO that encourages local community to commit to peace. And Fanny Benedetti, who will join us, the executive director of UN Women in France, who in 2000 worked to create UN Women, and I will ask you to give them a big round of applause.
Alors, quand je vous parle,
So, when I talk, I will take off my mask. So first, I would like us to talk about the role of women in wars. They're always presented as victims, whereas they are a very important capital to provide care, take care of children and the sick, but not only. Cher Shariev, we are delighted to be hosting you. When the war broke out in Libya in 2011, you were studying medicine and you decided to go and help in a hospital to take care of those who were injured. And then you changed forever. You became a full-time activist, and you said that we have to change the discourse on women. They must not be considered victims. They are powerful, as you say. They're very strong and they're very active. Could you tell us about this time?
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really sorry I wasn't able to be there in person, but I'm quite sure there will be other opportunities to have this reunion physically. Also, excuse me, there might be some delays in receiving the voice from you side or my side. I'm hoping everyone is able to hear me well.
we do.
And hopefully see me. That's great. The introduction you gave, and you already raised a few important points for France. Maybe I can just share more about my personal experience, because I feel my life is sort of divided into, if you look at it at a linear scale, there is before 2011 and after 2011. And these are completely two different lives. Even though before 2011, many people have an idea of how Libya looked like. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a democracy, but there was no wars. There was no armed conflicts. And then after 2011, or from February 2011, things has completely changed, and a new level of extreme form of violence started to occur within the society. Initially, it's true, I wanted to become a doctor. I was most probably influenced by Grey's Anatomy. So I started medicine school, and when the revolution, the armed conflict, the armed revolution started, I was in my first year of medicine school, and I lived close by to Gaddafi's compound, where there was heavy bombing. The fights around the area was very much extreme and heavy. So not all medical staff were able to reach the hospital, and that was the time where many hospitals and field clinics made calls for medical students to come and join. And I remember when I first went into the hospital and started working there, or actually volunteering there, the thing that struck me the most is that from February until August, during the revolution, we all thought this is going to be temporary. We all thought, there is going to be fights on the ground, armed groups are going to fight each other, there is airstrikes, there is bombing, and once Gaddafi is gone, then everything is going to be peace and safe again. And in my first day at the hospital, it really hit me so hard to realize that no, that's not going to be the case. Perhaps we will be able to build peace again, but it's literally, the revolution didn't end. The revolution just started now. And we're not talking about an armed revolution, but rather we're talking about people's revolution, the revolution where everyone understands that, okay, now it's the time to stop the violence, and just start working for people.
And so that's how you decide. Pardon. Et là, c'est là que vous avez décidé.
It's at that moment that you decided to become an activist.
Yeah.
Et donc,
So, as we wait for Betty Bigombe, who negotiated peace agreements with Joseph Kony when she got established in the north of Uganda, Fanny Benedetti, I would like to ask you, women, in fact, are very present in conflicts. They act much more than we think. They are not only victims. Isn't that right? Yes. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having invited me. I think that, yes, we're speaking French, and for our interlocutor who are there remotely, there's interpretation. So you have said women are indeed targeted victims of systematic crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, sexual crimes of a very big magnitude. This is something that has been observed very vastly, and they are also actors in terms of survival during the time of a conflict, because they maintain structures, community structures. They make it possible for the civilian population to survive during times of war. They are also the first. You talked about 70% of displaced persons during periods of conflict. In that respect, women are also, let's say, especially victims and impacted by conflicts. They are also belligerent. Women can and are part of belligerent forces. They are a very small percentage, and I would like to say we really have to make progress. They're a very small percentage of the peacekeeping forces, civilian or military, and they are also in the front lines. They are part of civil society. They mobilize themselves. As you have said, they mobilize themselves within associations. They are part of peaceful mobilization, we've seen this in many conflicts. There's mass mobilization of women, and this continues in Libya. It is ongoing in other contexts. For example, in Yemen, there was a group of women that met to call for a ceasefire. So they are on the front lines of peaceful movements to put an end to conflicts, but most often within the framework of actions of civil society and not within the framework of institutions where they are greatly underrepresented. I'd like to react to that. You said yourself, we think that peace, it seems stupid to say this, but we think that peace is the end of war. But no, it's not the end of war. The end of the war is when belligerents get together and say, okay, let's stop fighting, let us share power. But that's not going to build peace. Peace must be built, and women are very active in this respect. Women are half the population, so they're, of course, part of civil society, and they're very involved. Fanny Benedetti, I was very struck by what you said with regard to the Forum on Equality. You said we don't want a UN organization. We want to get rid of negotiations that don't mean anything, but we want to really be part of civil society. So does that mean women need a special strategy to circumvent things to be really part of civil society? Well, indeed, one of the characteristics, I would say, that is universal is that women are quite absent from decision-making powers and high-level official positions. So yes, they must and they do have a strategy to circumvent certain things. It's not just to circumvent, it is their commitment, their strongest commitment through civil society. That is through bodies that are not institutions. I don't think that what we want is what the reality is now, because these places where decisions are made, where budgets are adopted, women do not have any access or have little access to these positions. It does not mean we have to boycott these institutions, not at all. It just means that women must have their rightful roles in these places and in these institutions in decision making, but they don't for the timing. Hajir Sharif, you have co-founded Together We Build It, and you go to about 30 towns in Libya to explain to women that they have a power to act. Could you tell us more about what you do specifically and how it works, and what you have learned talking to these people, which perhaps, you know, is not the same as what we've just heard from Fanny?
It's a very good question with an evolving answer. Because as I said, when I first co-founded the Together We Build It organization, and as you can see from our name, our core belief is that everyone should and everyone have a role to play, whether in peace building or political transitions, etc. When we first started our work, our main focus and our heavily focus was about raising awareness of women and young women in all around Libya, with the importance of their role and, most importantly, their agency in peace building and decision making in general. And then we realized that it's not enough to only work on the local level and work with the people themselves, because there is this stereotype that women do not care about politics, women do not care about peace, and they do not care about war. While many of the women and young women we work with and we speak to and we engage with, they do have great interest and they want to influence. They are very eager to influence. The issue goes back to what Fanny mentioned, is that the decision-making processes in our organization, we call it the table, whether it's a peace table or a political table, that is not designed to accommodate women. There is no seats for women, and there is no opportunity for women to influence the decision-making process. Now, the reason that is very important and why we decided to adopt that as part of our work. So if you look at our approach, you can look at it as two ways approach. One, where we work with women and young women, build up their capacity, work together, brainstorm together and come up with initiatives together, etc. But also the other approach is to actually try to redesign this peace table and redesign the political table where we say, well, if women are active on the ground and if they are an important part of the society, then they need and they must be involved in the decision-making processes. Now, one interesting thing that usually happens when you say this, if you look at the peace table or the political table, it's often senior men who are sitting there. And when you tell them, well, we want women to be part of this table, they will usually tell you, well, which type of women and how many women. And if you tell them, well, we want young women to be there, they will ask the same question. And our answer is always all. We want all to be involved. We want all to be able to take part of decision-making processes because that is important.
Vous avez dit que de temps en temps, quand vous êtes à des tables de négociation, justement, vous...
You said sometimes you have to, you're told you have to sometimes talk more loudly.
It's like a man many times when you negotiate.
Yeah, that's true, and that's why we're saying it's important to redesign the peace table and the political table. Because if you look at it, it's few stages, it's many steps, so to say, to reach the decision-making table. First, you actually sort of need to break the door to be able to come in and to be offered a seat or to be able to sit on a seat. And when you're there, you sort of need to behave within the dynamics of the people who are sitting there, which is usually men. And this is not a call of, I'm not trying to advocate or label men as violent, but it's more about the type or the category of men who arrive at these negotiation table, because usually they are the ones who are going to argue and try to negotiate a power sharing deal. And that power dynamic is, if you're sitting with them, you sort of find yourself forced to physically and verbally behave like them just for you to be noticed, just for you to even have an opportunity to speak in a meeting, and just for you to be able to be taken seriously as well.
En réalité, c'est...
That's what we are all experiencing. Fanny Benedetti, it seems obvious to us, but could you specifically explain why it's so important that women be present in peace processes? Well, there are several reasons for that. First of all, because, as you've said, in terms of numbers, it's a total aberration that this is not the case, that women are not more present. Next, these times of transition are in the history of a country are ones with great impact and bring about a lot of transformation. So they have an impact for decades to come. So when decisions are taken, when they're made official on paper, funding, the public policies, the most significant arbitration takes place. The people present will have access to positions within the governance of the country. And of course, all of this will determine the future of a nation for decades to come. So necessarily, reconstruction cannot be complete if in these times of transition, and I'm not just talking about the signing of a ceasefire agreement, if women are not represented, their interests will not be taken into account for this post-conflict phase, which structures a great deal in the ensuing period. It's also an opportunity for states. We have seen this in Europe but also in other contexts. Conflicts can be an opportunity to change society, and very profoundly so, to change the structure of society. So to let that opportunity slip away, it would be a real mistake. You talk about the situation in Rwanda, where the situation was turned around. Women are very present. Yes, we mention this example often, especially in Parliament. Women are in the majority, especially and in the government. And this is quite striking because this is a country that went from an incredible drama, the genocide, to a renaissance where women have a very important role to play. It's a very striking example. I think in this, that there are other examples of post-crisis change. There's also a study of the International Peace Institute. You spoke of this, saying that in a peace agreement, women are involved. And when that's the case, there's 35% chance that the peace will be longer lasting. Fanny Benedetti, can you tell us what impact did Resolution 1325 to involve women more in the peace process have? And how's this working? What has the impact been? Indeed, that's a topic that's very important because here again, we're now at the 20-year anniversary mark of the taking into consideration by the United Nations Security Council of this topic, women, peace, and security. So we are celebrating this, in quotation marks, but this recognition is very important. The recognition of the role of women in crisis situations. This is a matter of international security, so it's something that's very important. There was this Resolution 1325, which is very complete and covers all the topics like women victims of violence, women actors in peace, prevention, fighting impunity, which is a very crucial factor. And all of this, how should I put this? This resolution is a roadmap for states to really act with all requisite political will, and the members of the UN Security Council to put this topic and the intentions and political will on this topic so the means will be deployed in the field. And there have been others in the past 20 years. This topic comes up time and again at the UN Security Council, and France is very active on this topic. I would even say that it's a leader, and that's a very good thing. Yet, the UN Secretary General has looked at the situation, and overall, he feels the situation remains bad, given that the implementation of this resolution and subsequent ones cannot be a source of satisfaction. It's quite insufficient. I'll go into some detail, but the means behind the very laudable political intentions, even if they're sincere, have not been forthcoming. Earmarked funding, as you have said, to ensure capacity building of women in the field is ludicrous. The amount you gave us shows what it is, 0.2% in bilaterals. It's just unthinkable. So women are not deployed in peacekeeping operations for many reasons. The mandates are so focused on protection of civilians in general, of displaced persons and civilians, but really we cannot have such weak peacekeeping forces with only 4% women. We've looked, 3% among the negotiators for peace agreements, so the results have been quite poor. That is why there have been some elements of progress, but the Secretary General himself says it, so I think I can allow myself to say it. He is calling upon UN Security Council members to remobilize themselves, to focus on this question, so that it will be, the resolutions will be implemented. Say it's hard. There are obstacles apparently to deploying women in these peacekeeping missions. I'm not saying it's simple, but we need a lot more will to get there. I think that the will is not at the requisite level. And Ajif Shariev, what obstacles do you encounter? Hajar Shariev, what obstacles do you encounter?
Yes, the obstacles, they really vary across different levels, right? Some of the obstacles are mainly related to working on the ground. Some of the obstacles are related to reaching decision-making processes. So if I would sum, or if I would give one word to these obstacles, I would definitely say stereotypes. And it's the narrative about women in peace and war. Because if you talk about war, the word in itself, many people will imagine a group of young men with weapons in the front lines. If you say peace, then people will imagine the same group of young men and men who were on the front lines with weapons, but this time they will imagine them without weapons. And that's why the solution, or like the typical traditional solution to peace, has sort of always been about power sharing deal. And that means that where earlier you used the word, which I found it very important as a description, is invisible. The main challenge is that we are invisible, that we are not seen, that we are not valued, that women are looked like as if they are not enough. Now, the issue with that is that regardless of how much you will work on the ground and regardless of how many people will mobilize for peace, if the decision that is being made is not in line with what people want, then these decisions, even if it was a peace agreement, it will always be distant and disconnected from what people want. So the main challenge is the stereotype, and it's the narrative that women are not enough and we are not seen as valuable contributors to peace.
C'est très intéressant ce que vous dites. Et ça...
What you're saying is very interesting, and it echoes what you're doing. You've invented this Libyan Wonder Woman image. I don't know if anyone has seen the film Wonder Woman, but it did me good to see a woman superhero. It changes from what we're used to seeing, and it made me enthusiastic. And you created this character. Could you explain to us what the character does and what the whole idea is to change stereotypes?
Yeah, so one of the campaigns and the projects we have at the Together We Build It organization, it's called Super Nsawin and Super Benawit. Nasawin in Libyan means woman and Benawit means young girls. So we decided, we've been working a lot on capacity building and empowerment. And then we came again to the conclusion that, well, women are powerful and they are empowered enough to make decisions, to literally contribute to every single field, whether peace, whether economy, you can just name it, including defense. But the issue is that, again, the narrative, we're not seeing that, well, we have these values and we have these contributions. So the idea of the campaign is just, instead of saying, well, we can, instead of trying to convince people and women that, well, you can do this and you're capable of doing it, we decided to depart from the point of view that it's as if it's granted that we can do it and everyone understand that. And through this campaign, the Super Nasawin and Super Benawit, which have, every time we launched the campaign, it reached millions of Libyans inside of Libya. It's just to show to people that, you know, in your ordinary circumstances, you don't need to be an exceptional superhero, because you are. If you are in situations such as Libya, where there is extreme challenges for women and young women just to function normally, if you're there, if you're still going to school, if you're still teaching, if you're still going to work, if you're still talking about harassment at the workplace, if you're talking about peace processes, if you're talking about the economy and you're doing and you're contributing something in that line, then for us, you are super Nasawin and you are super Banawit. And that was the whole idea of the campaign. Again, instead of trying to convince people and Libyans that, well, we should be looked at and accepted as superheroes, we just departed from the point of view that every woman in Libya and every young girl, they are already superheroes.
Et alors, Fanny Benedetti.
Fanny Benedetti, the world is totally connected. And I was wondering, in the West, could we do something to help women who are in areas of conflict? Because you're at UN Women France, and help women in crisis. I was thinking of Margot Wallström, a former Swedish foreign minister who came up with a manual for feminists through the UN. She thought that could help people in peace process. So could we ourselves be, do something to help by being more active? One of the successes of the 1325 resolution, because I talked a lot about, one thing that's very important is the knowledge that the public at large has of this topic. That's one very key issue, because right now, but in the past it has not been the case, but now the media does cover these issues. So people in the ground, in the field, the activists in the field, all these women have a lot more visibility than they used to have. So I think that this is one of the topics which we do have to continue to work on. The fact that we're here today shows this, to celebrate this what is usually obscure as an anniversary, but now people know about Resolution 1325. We can mention it in many important fora, and that in itself is a success, and I think we have to continue to do so. We have to ensure that everyone will be well aware that there is reliable information, and we have to make visible those who are invisible. That, I think, is what's most important. That's in the work we're doing. I think that is most important. And I think that this really can have a huge impact. Asher Shariaf, do you have the impression that we could help you?
Absolutely. To be honest, I'm very much convinced that everyone have a role to play when it comes to peace, but also when it comes to women and young women contribution to peace. Whether we're talking about people who are affected by wars and armed conflict, or whether we're talking about people who live in the countries that are classified as the most peaceful countries around the world. Because as you also mentioned something that is very important, the world is connected. And everything that is happening, even when it comes to wars and armed conflict, if we look at the war in Libya right now, we're not a single weapon that is produced in the country, not a single machinery that is manufactured in the country. So that just gives an idea how everyone is responsible. But to be more precise, when it comes to women and young women, and to make their role visible rather than invisible, well, I would say two things. First of all, we definitely need to change the narrative about what is wars and what is peace. And instead of looking at it just from the narrow point of view that is men fighting each other with weapons, no, we need to understand that war is much more than that. And then we can start looking at the women and young women there. But then also the second thing, apart from changing the narrative, is also when it comes to your role as people from France, or as Europeans, or as global citizens, to also make sure that you hold your own decision makers accountable. And to give you a precise example on that, for an example, if France is hosting a peace negotiation or a political talks on Libya, you cannot truly accept only for men to be involved. That's where you should be active on our behalf. If France is hosting something on Libya or having a peace initiative on Libya, you need to ask your government, you need to ask your president, you need to make sure that not only men are involved, and you need to ask the difficult questions for them, because at the end of the day, even if it's a foreign file, it's still something that is happening in France, and it's still something that is organized, for example, by French decision makers. And that should also be a reflection of France, which is very much active, as Fanny mentioned, when it comes to gender equality. And that should mean that everything that France does, whether it's internally in France or when it comes to foreign files, should be done from a gender perspective. And that's not only when it comes to France, but that also comes to all the other countries who are active in foreign files when it comes to women and peace.
Et pour conclure,
Thank you very much. In conclusion, Hajar Sharieff, you're part of the extremely good movement by Kofi Annan to fight the rise in extremisms, and this is one of his slogans. You're never too young to be a leader or too old to act. You are calling people to be actively, not to be nice somewhere, have moral values, but really to apply them, to be present in the field. You can't be good if you're not active, which doesn't mean that you don't have defects. You say that yourself. You have faults and defects, but you have to come out of your shell, come out of your comfortable life and get more involved. And it makes you happier.
I wasn't able to fully hear. I'm sorry.
Okay, pardon, je vais le dire en anglais. So you're part of Extremely Good from.
Donc vous êtes membre de Extremely Good, créé par Kofi Annan, et l'un de ses slogans est de dire.
In English without the French translation, because once you spoke English, there was a French translation.
Ah, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Alors, je la refais en français, pardon. Vous dites qu'il faut être qu'il faut être bon de façon active, c'est-à-dire ça suffit pas d'avoir des valeurs qu'on garde.
You're saying you must be actively good. You just don't have to be good and have your own values. You have to act. Even though you're not perfect, it makes you happier. And today you can't afford the luxury of staying at home and not acting for others.
Because I think many of us and many people around the world started having the idea that they trust the established systems now, and governments and parliaments and multilateral organizations and other groups to be active on their behalf. Maybe that was enough and it was working at some point, but as we see from what's happening around the world with the rise of racism and sexism and so many global issues that are coming more and becoming more severe now, we see more and more the need of ordinary people to be active. And this means that, you don't need to become a full-time activist, you don't need to join an organization, but it needs that you need to exercise your agency. If you're able, for example, to vote, if you are in a democratic system where you can vote for the good morals and the good values, then you should definitely do that. Because as we're seeing from many issues around the world, it's not enough to sit in your house and think, as long as I'm not doing something bad, then it means I'm not doing something bad and it's not going to result in something negative. I believe that this is a moment where everyone needs to have a say, and we're all responsible, because also the structure of the world, what is happening in Libya, it's not disconnected from what's happening somewhere else, and this includes also all other issues. We're looking at climate change, we're looking at poverty, we're looking at more increase even when it comes to wars and armed conflict. And that's why I'm saying you need to look at your circumstances. You need to look, where are you able to practice your agency? If you are in a democratic institution or system, then you need to be able to go and vote and voice your opinion. If you don't have the ability to do that, such as someone like myself, but also many Libyans, then you need to be more active, perhaps join organizations, or you just need to do something and you need to take an action. Because as I said, it's not enough to stay home and say, well, as long as I'm not contributing to something negative, that means it's not my fault and it's not my responsibility.
Merci infiniment à vous deux, Fanny Benedetti.
Thank you very much, Hajar Shayef and Fanny Benedetti, for joining us this afternoon. Right. We need to make our voices heard, as you are calling us to do. It's one of the challenges that victims of sexual violence in conflicts are confronted with. We'll talk about it in our second roundtable, the forgotten crime, sexual violence, and in the meantime, a very moving extract of Women by Anastasia Mikova and Jan Arthus Bertrand.
Mimi Eveline nimepelekwa ndani ya pori na wajambazi wenye kumiliki.
Well, I was raped, and 4 years ago another woman was kidnapped. We looked for her. We did not find her. Why rape? Why all these atrocities? Why kidnapping women? Why rebels don't stop? Why is there no peace in Congo and elsewhere in the world? Why do politicians intend to restore peace and stability for women in Congo and other countries? Why are women suffering? Why are girls suffering from kidnappings by rebels? They are not at peace. They go and pick wood and they are killed or kidnapped by armed rebels. The life of women is very short because of the armed rebels that wait for them in the bush. We suffer and we cry all along our lives. Ladies and gentlemen who lead Congo, leaders of Congo and of the world, we are subject to rape. You know that people are killed like wild animals, especially women, and you do nothing. Why? I was 19, and one evening I was coming back from the market around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I came up to armed rebels from the Raya Mutomboti militia. They took us and they took us to the woods, and they started killing those of us who did not want to sleep with them. I was very sad. They raped me, but they didn't stop there. They took a knife and they introduced it in my anus and vagina, and then they took grasses, they picked grasses, and they put them in my vagina. I felt very ill. I arrived at the hospital and I noticed that there were many women from our region of Kwalonge, and I felt really very bad, very ill, because I realized that we could not escape, and I started to have mental disorders. My health was not improving. I was not getting better, and they decided to bring me here to Bukavu. I had to move to go to a family. I was living in the campus at that time. When I arrived there, the soldiers were going from one house to the other, and they found me there. The family had gone. I was there with my brother, peace to his soul. He was epileptic, and I couldn't leave and leave him there, alone. And it is at that time that 3 soldiers raped me. They left. I took my brother to take him to hospital, and I went with him and we crossed the border. That's where he was treated. But I was too scared to say that I had been raped. I did not say it. 1 month later, I fell pregnant. I was able to have an abortion. Unfortunately, the consequences of that abortion are following me even now, 14 years later. 4 years later, sorry. Deep down, everything was destroyed in me. I feel that I don't understand men. I don't understand a man who rapes and destroys. I could say the organ that he took pleasure with, because when a man rapes, is it pleasure that he's seeking? What is it that they have in their minds? Because this sexual act is normally a pleasure for everybody. And he destroys that organ. I don't understand this kind of man. I would find it very hard to answer the question if I were that man. It's like cutting the roots of a tree. It's the greatest sign of contempt that you can show not only a woman but the whole of humankind, because it is women that give life. It's women that bear humanity, give birth to humanity, and destroying a woman is destroying yourself. I was raped by soldiers, and then I became pregnant following that rape, and I hated that pregnancy, and I suffered a lot. My thoughts hurt me very much. I couldn't sleep any longer. I could not eat any longer. I was in pain. I was suffering until the day I gave birth. After giving birth, I started hating my child. I couldn't love that child. I breastfed it because it had come out of my belly, but not one day did I love that child. I never loved that child. It was a daughter. It was a girl. Her name was Gloria. I did not give her her name. I refused to feed her because I did not feel any joy in having a child. Soldiers use rape to make families vulnerable, to terrorize them. I lived this situation, and deep down I know that all the people who do that, they do it to destroy our society, to annihilate our society. They don't give value to Congolese women, women who were sacred, who are no longer sacred, who have become a battlefield, as people say. All wars in DRC are fought on her. And to me, this means destroying our society, because the way things are going, our society is a society of traumatized people. Because I was raped like Tatiana, and my family directly or indirectly suffered from traumas. They are traumatized, just as much as I am traumatized. And I'm thinking about a neighbor who was raped in the blood of her father. Her father wanted to stop her daughter from being raped, and he was shot, and his daughter was raped in her father's blood. It was not a rape that had been done by chance. It was a willingness to destroy that woman. That's why I believe that rape is a weapon, a war weapon.
Bonjour.
Good afternoon. I'm Caroline Six and I work for ELLE as a journalist. Before welcoming our guests, I'd like to take some time to pay tribute to these women that you just heard in this extract from the film by Anastasia Mikova and Jan Arthus Bertrand. I'd like to pay tribute to their courage, to the courage that they showed to give testimony to the public in front of the cameras of these acts of barbarity, and that they might be subject to again. And their emotion is very pregnant in the film. If they do it, it is on behalf of all those women who did not do it because they were ashamed, because they had no place where to talk about it, or because trauma made them silent. We know that breaking the silence is the precondition to a long process, a process that leads the victim to the condition of survivors, sometimes peace activists and actors of change. The health crisis deprives us from the presence of Tatiana Bucanere that we heard during this extract, and she could have told us in an intimate way, but also a political way, of this problem of the stigmatization of victims. As I saw in DRC in 2011, where I met many women who had survived, stigmatization is the first cause of the silence of women and the first obstacle to any process of repair. Wherever barbarity is in control, victims are confronted with the double penalty of being rejected by their families and by their community, and it's one of the goals of their torturers. Stopping this taboo is one of the first steps in this process of repair, and Tatiana Mukamera called her network of survivors, Sewa, which in Swahili means to say. For survivors to talk, it is important because it highlights this plague that is at the heart of what concerns us today, as Fanny Benedetti said. The problem today is how to prevent wars and respond to new threats, and silence remains the major accomplice of barbarity. And some break the silence and put their lives at threat. It's impossible to open this roundtable without talking about the work of Denis Mukwege. Many of you know him. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2018 for 20 years. He's been repairing women in the Kanzi hospital in Congo, and he has really put to the knowledge in front of the eyes of the world the fact that rape was used as a war weapon. The problem today is that his action has led him to receiving again death threats. Now, there's a report by the High Commissioner for Human Rights where war crimes in DRC are listed, and he underlines that in the region of Kivu, still in the hands of dozens of armed bands, the same ones are continuing to kill since the 90s. I'm going to stop for a minute on this period of the 90s under the control of Céline Bardet. That it is our honor to welcome this afternoon because it's a crucial period for the subject of rapes used as war weapons, because it was a turning point in the use of the rape of civilians in conflicts. It's crucial to say it because we still hear today that rape is a fatality, a collateral damage of war, and that it always existed. In fact, it is in the 90s, at the end of the Cold War and the great political destabilization that it led to, that we really started seeing rape used as a war weapon. Why? Because these rapes in Bosnia or in DRC, just to mention these two examples, became massive. As we saw in this extract, they were extremely violent. Men were using objects, tools. They were not done by violent, isolated men, but they were planned coldly by warlords. Within their political strategy in Bosnia, there were rape camps that were set up recently. It was proven that Daesh used manuals for rape to enslave Yazidi women, and we'll come back to silence later on, but we estimate between 200,000 and 600,000 as the number of rapes in DRC. In Burma, rape used as an ethnic cleansing weapon affected over 50,000 people, and it's not about to stop. In 2018, the UN listed 19 worrying situations. It's not about to stop because sexual slavery is a very effective tactic to destroy a society cheaply. These violent rapes aim at destroying the genital system of women, as Denis Mukwege witnesses every day, and when it's not the case, raped women very often become pregnant by their torturers, with all the consequences that this implies on whole generations. And the goal is also to displace full populations. In early 2020, in the province of Tanganyika, southwest of Congo, there were 350,000 displaced persons, internally displaced persons. They still live in Congo, but in very bad camps, in very painful conditions. Last week, the investigators of the Independent Committee on Syria described the systematic war that militias in Ankara develop against Kurd women. They rape them. For displaced populations, sexual persecutions are continuing when they migrate, as we will see with Dr. Khada Hatem Kanser, who will participate in this roundtable as well. Now, of course, this seems tragic and very disillusioning, but like the women we heard in the film, some people are fighting. There are ways of stopping this terrible circle. With us in this roundtable, we will have women working for peace in the field. First, it means repairing victims physically, psychologically, economically, but it's also based on the fight against impunity locally and internationally. And it also involves the fight against toxic masculinity, as Dr. Hatem Ganser and Dr. Mukwege say. Now, please welcome our guest, Laurence Fischer, who was world champion in karate 3 times since 2006. Since 2006, she has put her passion for sport at the service of her humanitarian commitment, side by side with Dr. Mukwege and Dr. Hatem Ganser, ambassador of sport for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs since 1919. She created an NGO that she's going to present later on. We also welcome Céline Bardet, who is an international lawyer. Céline is an international lawyer and an expert in war crimes. She did huge work in the field in Bosnia in collaboration with local institutions, but also at international level to make some progress in the court decisions about war crimes. After various missions in Libya for the European Commission, she founded in 1994 her NGO, We Are Not Weapons of War. It's the first NGO fully dedicated to rape as a war weapon. And lastly, Dr. Hada Hatem Ganzer, who is joining us now. Who is a gynecologist and obstetrician specialized in surgery and the repair of sexual mutilations. We know her better in France because she created the Maison des Femmes in Seine-Saint-Denis, close to Paris, an exceptional place which is really the model of the treatment of victims of sexual violence. And she published a book telling about her fight in the country of ordinary machism. Céline, I'm going to talk to you first as an international investigator. You specialize in war crimes. You founded an NGO dedicated to the fight against rape as a war weapon. You launched an initiative in Bosnia to organize the first lawsuits that condemn the perpetrators of those crimes. You worked in more than 50 countries, and recently you collaborated to the documentary Libya Anatomy of a Crime, which revealed the number of rapes in detention camps in Libya. Can you explain first how women and also men in Libya, why the bodies of women have become a battlefield everywhere there are conflicts? In your speeches, you always talk about a perfect crime. Can you explain what you mean and how is it a common law crime? Thank you. And thank you for this very full introduction about the situation of sexual violence during conflicts. Well, it's a perfect crime because, as we saw in what Tatiana was saying and what others said, it's a perfect crime because beyond the act that is very violent, it's a crime that also generates taboos, shame, and an impact on the direct victim, but also, as Tatiana explained very well, on their whole families. We're talking about sexual violence during conflicts. Very often those are rapes that are extremely violent, that are done publicly, very often in front of the woman's family, because there is a special purpose, a special goal, which is to socially destroy that person. I would also like to thank you for referring to the fact that we're talking about women specifically today. I'm a lawyer specializing in war crimes. I work on rape as a war weapon, and I approach it through the angle of crime. So even though women represent the greatest majority of these crimes, many men are also victims. We have no figures. We have no figures anywhere. It's one of my obsessions. Actually, we'll come back to that later. But it's important to recall that men are also victims and that it creates taboos. So it's the perfect crime also because it's very cheap. When you want to wage a war and use rape, it's very cheap. And there is this silence. It's a crime that is also very difficult to prove because if you don't have material evidence, immediate material evidence, and we'll come back to this later, people have to talk, and that's something that you find in common law, sexual violence. So for all these reasons, it's the perfect crime. And I'd like to add one last thing. Before, we were talking about the need to take action in the round table before that I thought was extremely interesting, and what the Libyan woman was saying, I think, was extremely perceptive. And Tatiana should have been here today. I know her very well. And right now, she is demonstrating for peace in Bukavu with other women. And Denis Mukwege is also going to talk today. It's a very important day for mapping and for justice. So we can't separate the issue of sexual violence in conflicts from international crime or the circumstances of conflicts. We've been talking about this since the morning, and it's very important. So we're talking about taking action. So under the control of Hervé Morin, I'm suggesting that today we could maybe have a stand-up or video, and we could send them something to Bukavu, to Denis, who was here last year, and I was very glad that I was there, that was here last year as well, and I'm glad to be here again this year. But maybe we should do this, because as you said this morning, the Normandy region supports Denis Mukwege, you support everything that he's doing, and we're talking about action. Maybe we could do something, because these women are marching today, they're demonstrating.
Voilà, pardon.
So, yes, they are marching alone in Bukavu in a context, and we see this demonstration. These were victims of atrocious crimes. To someone who raises her head, and I think someone said that, okay, we will take our place at the table. We want justice, reparations. We want people to see us, and we want to tell people what has happened to us. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you. Laurence, I will turn to you, because now we're talking about this process of reparations, which is a very long and arduous process, which has various stages, and you are taking a very concrete part in this. It's quite recent, I think, this therapy that you offer, that is necessary. You worked at the Orcaus house with Dr. Mukwege, but they're also in a house with another doctor as a sports champion. You are offering a form of reparation, of repair through the body. How is this essential? What can it give people? And why is it perhaps not the first, but one of the fundamental steps, as Celine has said, to going from a survivor to a real actor and an active member of their society? Thank you. Thank you for this question, and I'm delighted to be here with you. I'm very touched by the testimonies of these women, and I think that's why I'm very committed. And I said to myself when I met Dr. Mukwege in a forum, a world forum of French-speaking countries in sports, we felt that, and I felt I wanted basically my sports experience to be put to the service of these victims. And what I observed when I went to this foundation, in looking at this multidisciplinary accompaniment of women, the place of their body did not figure among their healing. So the trauma came through their body, but the repairing of their body, there was the physical, the surgical repair of their body, but this rebuilding of their body through their body wasn't happening. I am a sports expert. I'm an athlete. So I know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about post-traumatic stress, a situation in which women find themselves. So that's why I created Fight for Dignity, because I had two objectives when I went: that they could take their body back, take control of their body, and that they could get their confidence back. And sports is good for that. It's good for building confidence. Like, they could do karate or soccer, and after 1 year, some of them were 18, they're the most vulnerable. 20 now practice sports on a daily basis, and 3 of them told me that they want to return to Guma and Bukavu, and I want to transmit this. I want to prevent what happened to me from happening to my sister, my cousins, and others. So you can understand why I created this structure. It has to have some continuity. And I also was lucky to meet Rada or Hada rather, and this happened in a holistic, multidisciplinary way. All these different skills came into play in Saint-Denis and in Kivu. So all these things are put to the service of women, and sports is part of that, and it works. That's why within this framework I have committed to this. It's important to highlight this because it's a very efficient way of being sure that we're talking about empowerment of women, social inclusion. We heard of stigmatization. This is a powerful means for these women to once again being re-included into society. Proper physical activity for them can help them to feel better about themselves. They can then reintegrate into society, find their place in society. Yes, that is absolutely essential, and that's why you have also included this type of therapy into your House of Women. Dr. Hada Hatem Kanser does extraordinary work in this House for Women in Saint-Denis, where many services are provided to women victims of sexual violence. You experienced the war in Lebanon, where you were born, and rather in Lebanon, and you are sensitive to these issues. I want to come back to something that Lance has just brought up. I think you could also talk to us about this, but now to focus on new threats. All these women known as migrants, who are exiles, who come to your hospital and whom you take care of. I would like to know, how do they get to you? Because one of the major problems is that there are few places where women can be heard, accompanied, cared for. How do they get to you, in fact? And what are their specific needs today, given that they have been subjected to all this? Thank you for highlighting this topic, something that is dear to our hearts, because when I opened this House of Women, I did not think it would become a house for migration. But of course, those working on excision, and through excision, we do get many women from Africa who are sometimes born in France, but it was on a trip to their country that they underwent excision. So we also have migrants, like some women who've just arrived in France for, let's say, 3 days, and we've been, let's say, labeled as a place where they could be helped. They have enormous needs. First of all, they have social needs. They need shelter. They need to eat, to wash, and they need for us to take care of their trauma, because rape is a weapon to destroy what is intimate, private, whether it be during wars or in our homes. And for me, it's the same topic. We are destroying children, French children, in their homes by their parents, people close to them who are supposed to protect them. We destroy all of their self-esteem. We turn them into these empty people who've been tarnished, who have been forced into silence. There is the premeditated, massive side of this when it's a weapon of war. You talked about Lebanon. During the Civil War, I was 15 years old, and I heard my neighbors and parents saying, well, that girl was raped by Syrian soldiers, by these people of the same religion, and I could not understand this drama because this girl would disappear from the village. Her family would be, pushed onto the outskirts of society instead of taking care of what this girl had experienced. Everyone was obsessed with dishonor and shame. And that, among other things, was what led me to get into this. So rape is an awful weapon. I think we need to deal with this at the international level, but also the national level. And it was great to meet Laurence, just to meet her as a person. And of course, at the House of Women, we take care of bodies, but also spirits, because we have also psychiatrists and psychologists who work with psychological things such as disassociation. For example, someone can have been raped and then only remember it 30 years later when something triggers the memory. So all types of care are helpful. Social workers, sexologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, lawyers, police officers, also midwives. All these people come to us and they, let's say, propose karate, art therapy, dance, theater. And the people who are in Laurence's workshop are amazingly transformed because Laurence has them work on their perineum, which is an area that's been traumatized. And she tries to help them make it a place that could be a place of pleasure, which would be a hell of a change. And then theater as well. Drama, for people who've never ever expressed anything and who are allowed to scream. So theater is also a great supplementary tool as a type of therapy. So we have just spoken of the repair aspect, which is something that takes a long time and is a big part of this topic. With Céline and Prada, if you want to talk about this issue of the importance of having a voice, as I've said in my introduction, I hail the courage of these women who have the courage to speak out. It's the first step toward repairing themselves and to recognizing their status as a victim and not as someone who's guilty of anything. The fact that they are talking can be a problem. Why? Because women often have to repeat this story innumerable times, and it's not necessarily beneficial for the women to have to repeat it. And also the problem which does arise is to have to collect evidence, and that this story does come over time and sometimes changes over time. And you as an NGO, we are not weapons of war. This is your NGO. You have a tool to try to redress this issue, which is both legal and psychological. Could you perhaps explain what this application and the backup is for it? Yes, there's a lot in what you have said, indeed. So let's start with that. It's not exactly an application. It's a bit like Canada Dry. It's the form of an application, but I'd like to specify that it is not one. It's a mobile website. I have no technical skills or technological skills, but it does not have to be downloaded, because we are talking about countries or places like Kivu. That's something that's very important. We have a system whereby everything gets erased. There's no trace left on on the devices. So that's why I have to state it's not an application. Now, with regard to the testimonies and what backup does, is this whole issue of having a voice. This is something that we have to be careful about, and I hope we will agree that we're talking about women and victims, and that each person is an individual. Sometimes we have a tendency to want to, let's say, come up with a solution, come up with principles, but everyone's an individual. I'm talking about war rape, or rape in times of war. I know survivors who will want to speak out, and that helps them. It's good for them. Others who will not want to do it. Some will feel harmed by it. It's like in life, we're all different. So it's very important to first and foremost be listening to the person and what that person feels and what that person wants to do or not. I'm saying that because today we're in a situation where, on the one hand, things are very positive because there's more and more talk of sexual violence in conflicts. We have the Me Too movement here in France and everywhere else, and that's important. So let's say freedom of expression has been increased, but we have to be careful that this freeing up of expression is not something that is going to feel to victims like an injunction, like they're being subjected to it. In other words, if they don't speak, they'll be deemed as being not very courageous. Now, and this is with my legal perspective, well, what's the point of giving people a voice? Well, it's a type of therapy when it's well structured, when it's done at this House of Women. It has a purpose, and how should I put this? It's structured, accompanied. Personally, I get really upset by journalists, and not only. What upsets me is that we don't continue to accompany the person who has expressed themselves. And that's dramatic, or it can be. So the backup is there from a legal point of view. As we had said earlier, on the one hand, there are many places where their women are not identified, or they don't have a place where they can go. So the backup makes it possible for these people to identify themselves. It's a beginning to say, I am here and I exist, and that's important for these women. And indeed, there's a small questionnaire which gives us like a little report that there is Solange somewhere in the Central African Republic. We will then contact this person. We work at a local level to enable this person to be given some care services set up on site. We don't come in by helicopter everywhere. We work at a local level a lot because it's important to build capacity locally and to stop coming locally and telling people what they should be doing. On the other hand, there's the back office. That is, all the information that is transmitted by that person is secured. The person can send photos, and that's very important because the facts have just been committed, an act has been committed. Often, these women have nowhere to go. So then time goes by, some injuries can disappear. And bear in mind, these people are often in difficult conditions, and they're quite resourceful. I've seen women work things out themselves, but when you look at this issue of evidence, we then have no evidence. So they can take photos. We secure the photos to keep it simple. We have a system that enables us to analyze and then to prepare a complaint. For Libya, we have done this. We were in the complaint stage, and subsequently we follow the fact that the person has been taken care of in the field, and we can continue to monitor the person to see whether they have problems and do so constantly. We also can receive alerts in real time. So it's not just a question of figures, but we know what's happening, so we can transform this into an alert tool, or rather a prevention tool, to study what's happening, to communicate, to prevent certain things. And I think that was the theme of this topic, that is how to prevent certain things. So it's useful for all of these things, and to have clear figures on what is going on, and of course to conduct more valid legal proceedings. It's important, legally speaking, and I'm talking at the international level, when you have victims getting to the legal proceedings, let's say maybe only 1% get there, they've been interviewed so much, they've had to repeat 50,000 times their story. So they will sometimes answer what we're asking them, and at the end of a hearing, it's almost like we have polluted their testimony, because there's a lot of difficulty in terms of international criminal justice, and as you know, I criticize this, but there's a problem here too, because justice cannot condemn when, unless it's got real evidence. Yes, there's trauma, but we need to have consistent testimony. We need to constantly interact with the victim, so we need to have work done 360 degrees, and that's how this House of Women is working really well. We've got really everything covered: psychological, legal, economic, social support, and other alternatives. Not everything requires a psychological response. Sometimes through sports, many things can be helped. So we require that response as well. I spoke for too long? No. We don't have that much time, but I will just highlight what you are emphasizing. This is a very complex matter. It's a bit of a ghost, if you will. It's hard to grasp it, to get concrete figures. It's hard to get a grasp on the scale of the crime. So it's hard to then be successful in legal proceedings. Just to conclude, and you correct me if I'm wrong, in terms of the law, there is a legal arsenal that has been set up in many countries to fight these war crimes. Like we have the same thing here in France on sexual violence. So it's not always easy. How are we going to hear to women so that it won't be more destructive, rather than trying to help women repair themselves? Of course, we have to set up structures, and as we had earlier said, these areas where women can come are quite rare, and what you are setting up and what the Dr. Mukwege has set up in the Congo, as what you have done here in France, these are rare places that have to be developed, and we need the means to do so. Their resourcefulness, perspicacity are what make them quite unique. Their holistic approach. I don't know if you've got this system in your hospital. There is this one-stop system, I believe. That means women only have to explain the situation once, explain everything, and then they have like a personalized approach where they themselves choose through various services offered what they need. So this reflects what they require. So it's not just, this bunch of women. They're all women with their own story and who need an individual response to their situation. I think that's the spirit in which you're working. Yes, indeed, this idea of repetition is an issue. Women feel like they're becoming a victim every time they tell the story. We are caregivers, so we have a shared medical dossier or file, and so that the victims don't have to retell the story. It's up to them to decide whether they want to do so. At the time of the complaint, that has to be told. The police will not be satisfied with just what we've written down. They need very precise elements, and these are very difficult question periods for women. And women are so rarely asked to speak that when you open the door for women to speak a bit, it's hard to explain to you. You see in their eyes, they're like, wow, someone's letting me talk. Although I've never been asked to do so. So I'm going to take the opportunity. We just have to make sure that it's done properly, not abused. But for women, it is the beginning of a long process of healing. And then we prescribe to them, okay, you'll go see Laurence, you can go do this, that, the other thing if you like. But for us, it really is a type of medication. All of these complementary prescriptions, medication. And Laurence, as you described earlier, these women all of a sudden reconnect with their bodies. And that's the beginning. We've said this several times. It's the beginning of a process. They can, once again, take command of their lives, become politically perhaps engaged, committed. This is something that's very important. I believe that indeed you would agree that we cannot expect women to do everything to resolve all these problems at the international level. Fighting impunity is very difficult. It's hard to gather evidence, and then ensuring that people are that the perpetrators are convicted, and especially those who give the orders. I don't know if we have time to talk about this. With the Nobel Peace Prize attributed to Dr. Mukwege and Maurad, who was defending the Yazidi sexual slaves, is this voice at the international level. Has this specifically changed anything with respect to states? Have states taken commitments? Have they made commitments? Are things changing at a different level other than at the level of women themselves? Are you asking me that question? Well, are there reasons to hope that this problem will be addressed at the international level? Well, yes, there are grounds for hope, and if I did not see that we were moving forward, I think I'd move on to something else, because my life's already complicated. But this issue of impunity, and I'm talking about rape during conflicts. There are many issues here, but again, there's a given context. That this is a war crime against humanity, genocide. It's very complex. So it's not just one rape. And then you have to go up the chain of command. The fact that we're talking about it more, that there were these two Nobel Peace Prize laureates, Nadia Morani and Dr. Mukwege, means, of course, that we are talking about this more. As I said at the beginning, Dennis today, that's 10 years of mapping. He's in his country. He's in the street with women today. So he's a Nobel Peace Prize laureate working in the street with these women, and he still has no answer. So we can be present. We can say that everything Denis is doing, and it's fantastic. I've known him for 15 years, but at some point we have to say, where are the actions? And this entails political issues. I hear often that there's impunity, and indeed there's impunity, because it's hard to talk about it. It hasn't been a long time since we started talking about it, but there are criminal proceedings underway in the DRC, so things are happening. And another thing you referred to when we talked about repair or reparations, we can't go into detail, but it's not just the legal reparations. There are many survivors who do not want to go through judicial proceedings. Judicial proceedings are a type of reparations, but that's a way of saying things happened. Yes, we want to get reparations, but reparations for a victim means having a place to go to be heard and be believed. Many people don't want to go and report this for many reasons. So we have to build around this justice using means. I've had an NGO for 5 years, and we work with less than 100,000 euros per year. And thanks to Luxembourg, we will be able to develop this. We're going to be talking about sexual violence in conflicts. I just wanted to discuss this. So we have to be aware that we have to provide means. The House of Women, we see it's working. Let's create more, 100 everywhere. Let's go. That's what we have to do. Action is that. Things don't change unless we have money earmarked for these things. We see it's working, but let's do it. It doesn't cost millions. I don't know how much you cost, but it's true. For things to change, we have to move. We have to take real action, and justice is moving forward, but it will continue to move more if we continue to accompany victims. So the victims want to go through judicial proceedings, feel accompanied by us so that they can get through this, or they have to give a testimony. We have to do analysis to identify perpetrators. We usually know them. The backup also works on that. We collect these elements. So it's not all on to change things. We have not yet changed things. We need to use these means, and we have to do this now, because that's how we can extricate ourselves from this situation. Sexual violence is not something that has to continue. It doesn't have to be this way. So we need all these aspects, the social and the legal.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I have to conclude this roundtable, and I'm sorry because I'm sure there is still a lot to say about this topic. Laurence, you wanted to add something? Yes, very quickly about this morning. We talked a lot about the fact that we need to take our fate into our hands and commit. I heard Dr. Mukwege, you heard the women, so I committed with my expertise, and I'm going to go further. I'm ambassador for sports in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs that is trusting me, and Véronique Roger-Lacan and other women, Delphino, we are committed. We do a lot in the field. I started with nothing. I probably did not reach out to many women yet, probably very few, as Céline was saying, not enough. But with RADA and the teams, we try to do as much as we can, and it works. There's not much. You are all experts in something. You all have an expertise, so commit. We talked about love this morning. I do what I do because I love it, because I love karate and sports, and because it works. So it's really a cry from the heart. Commit yourselves. We know that there's not much that is needed, and it works. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Laurence, for your energy, which maybe gives us confidence. Rada, maybe you want to add something before we conclude? A question to Céline. Céline, I receive women who are pregnant after war rapes, and when I call the police station and say, can I have her abort? And I ask whether the fetus is a piece of evidence. Well, get the following answer: not in your wildest dreams. What do you think? Well, if it's important, why not? You should communicate on that. We might be able to do something. Maybe there are ways of using the fetus as evidence. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to close this roundtable, and I would like to thank my guests. They gave us a very comprehensive idea of the complexity of this issue. And we are going to welcome Florence Besson. Well, Florence Besson is going to moderate the third roundtable on climate and the leadership of women. And in the meantime, a portrait of Louise Weiss. Thank you. Have a very nice afternoon. This is Louise Weiss, who is talking to the crowds. She's a pioneer of a European and feminist world. She has an incredible technique, used the codes of society to better destroy them. The rebel in a pearl necklace. My first idea was to get to know everything in the world. Since young girls were not supposed to know anything, I did not agree. A pure product of Republican education, Louis Weiss is as comfortable in front of the family arms as on the benches of the first schools for young girls, and she doesn't let anybody decide about her fate. I was raised by women who were the first women who passed the agrégation to become professors. And these remarkable women put in my head ideas of emancipation. I followed their teaching. I owe everything to public education. She was a convinced European in favor of Germany and France becoming closer, but she changes her mind in 1933, the day Goebbels' speech is uploaded at the Society of Nations. I had the feeling that war was unavoidable and that the Society of Nations had failed. A chapter in my life had closed and I started a new one. Women had their say in the evolution of history. They had to conquer the right to become full-fledged citizens. Louise Weiss leaves the magazine she created, New Europe, and launches the New Woman to obtain the vote right for French women. I talked with the women who had won the war of feminism in England, the suffragettes. They told me there is only one method. You have to be on the front page every day. Louise Weiss supplies this advice, but in her way. I handled powder, rice powder. With Louise Weiss, violence is always symbolic and she's always nice in what she says. Well, she is really very strong, but pleasant at the same time. And she talks to senators who fear that women voting are going to divert them from their tasks in the household. In 1994, her fight bears fruit. Later, Louise Weiss is going to travel the world to understand men and to fuel her work in favor of peace. In 1979, she goes back to her land of birth, Alsace, the epicenter of war. In the meantime, she is elected to the European Parliament in Strasbourg. She's the first woman to be elected and the oldest member of parliament. But you see her driving her car. She has not changed a bit until the end of her life. She has too many fights to fight. Good afternoon again, and thank you for being here in such great numbers for the third and last roundtable. Now we are going to move on to another subject, climate and women who are leaders to preserve peace in conflicts linked to climate change. Climate disruption makes the situation of women worse because they are responsible for feeding and giving water to their children. They have to go farther to work the land, to find water, and they can't go to school. They have to marry earlier. They have more children. In 2019, 33 million people had to leave their village, and 70% of these people were women after a climate disaster. And more domestic violence as well is something that they are confronted with. Now, if climate change and global warming reaches 3 to 4 degrees, the World Bank thinks that 14 million people could be on the roads by 2050. Now, ecocide exacerbates conflicts because sometimes there are bad crops, and some think that bad crops in China in 2010 were at the origin of Arab Spring. Women, again, are victims of violence and of the lack of access to health care, but very little world funding is allocated to projects against ecocide and equality. What can we do? Why? Guido Umaru Ibrahim is part of the members of the panel to answer this question. She's a geographer and an activist in Chad. You militate in favor of the environment and the recognition of indigenous knowledge. Marie Leroy, who is in charge of NGO care in France and fights extreme poverty, and Delphine O, ambassador and secretary general of the Forum Generation Equality. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for being here with us. Indu Ibrahim, I'd like to start with you. You are 35, and since you are 15, you've been an activist in your country in Chad, where you created the Association of Indigenous Pearl Women in Chad. You explained that when it's 48 degrees and Lake Chad is completely dry, 90% of it is dried, and 40 million people are dependent on this lake, obviously violence against women increases. Can you explain what's going on in your country and the causes of violence? Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be with you all today. And talking about climate change, for me, reflects the daily life of my community. As you said, well, I'm from Chad, and the example of Lake Chad is known by everybody. 90% of the lake is dry. Well, when my mother was born, and in my time, well, the lake is completely dry, and that's an obvious evidence of climate change. Now, beyond that, climate change is not only impacting water, it has an impact on our daily life, on society, social matters, environmental matters. We see that the rain season is more and more rare, with stronger rainfall. As we see right now in Sahel, there are floods everywhere, in all cities, in Khartoum, everywhere. You can go anywhere, you will witness this. So you need a boat to go from one house to another, without talking about people who suffer from this and who have to leave because of those floods. On top of this, 4 months ago, it was over 50 degrees Celsius. So we move from one extreme to another. But this is not even the hardest thing. It's the consequences of that, which is food insecurity. And we see that women are the first victims of climate change, not only because they have to walk very far to find water, which we know, but because women are there to feed the community. They don't have a supermarket where they can go and buy packaged food or a salad or beef. They only have the bush that is going to give them leaves that they keep during the dry season and that they'll eat during the rain seasons. They feed the children. They use the leaves for traditional medicine as well. I'm talking about my community. We don't have electricity. We don't have a supermarket. We don't have a pharmacy. We don't have a healthcare center. The bush is our supermarket and our pharmacy. The bush is also the place where we go to school, where we receive our education. So if climate change has an impact on our lives, this is not television, it's not a documentary, it's the real life of people every day. And all these impacts, there are many of them, and they are impossible to accept, because 4 or 5 degrees, it's not something I can imagine, because we already have seen an increase of 1.5 degree. Delphino, can you tell us what The impact is on violence on women. You are in charge of women's rights. Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me and for highlighting this issue, gender and climate. It's not very well known today, the issue of the place of women in conflict, sexual violence as well, that we discussed before. It's becoming more well known, but the connections between the fight against climate change and gender equality is not a topic that is well known by the public at large, but it's emerging in particular in feminist organizations which are at the spearhead of all this reflection. As you said, women are the first to be affected by food insecurity because of climate change and global warming. But we see that when there is any disaster, tsunami, another disaster that creates a situation of crisis, of conflict, women are directly impacted. Many studies show that the number of forced marriages increases considerably after a climate disaster because families are poorer and they are impoverished and they need new income, and very often this new income comes from forced marriage. Sexual violence that was very well described in the previous roundtable also increased because rape is a war weapon, but it's also a weapon in situations that are similar to conflicts. Climate disasters, for instance. I'd like to go back to what Idu was saying with a few figures. In the countries of the South today, in developing countries, between 60 and 80% of farming production is created by women. Women are responsible. They are farmers. They are responsible for producing food, but they receive only 10% of the income generated by the production of foods. That is at the heart of economic and social inequalities between men and women with farming and climate change. Marie Leroy from CARE, what are the areas that are the more at risk and how can these risks be evaluated? Thank you very much for giving me the floor on behalf of CARE, and I support what Delphine said on the fact that we are very happy to see this subject being discussed today because it's very important. I like to talk about a double injustice, discrimination of people and climate change that women are victims of. We see that countries in the South are in the front line of the impacts of climate change. We consider that the 10% of the 50% of the poorest in the world are responsible only for 10% of greenhouse gases emissions, but they are submitted to most of the impact, drought, scarcity of resources, and women are in the first line in front of climate change, as my colleagues were saying. And conversely, we represent 10% of the population, the richest. We're responsible for 50% of CO2 emissions. And well, what are the areas that are the most impacted? South America, Central Africa? Well, the countries of the South in general, in rural areas and in cities as well, because today 10 of the cities that are the most exposed to risk connected with climate change are located in Africa. The Sahel area is very much exposed as well, but Ido can say that better than myself. And CARE is on all continents in more than 90 countries in Central Africa, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and also Asia. Indu, you said that the future of the fight against climate change is in Africa. And you were talking about your grandmother, Mama Ada, and she's got a millenary knowledge, an indigenous knowledge that we are letting die. But we could combine it with current scientific knowledge and it could save us. Yes, it's true, because when we talk about fighting climate change, Africa has not waited. And I can tell you that indigenous people have not waited. As you said, Mama Ada is my grandmother. We don't have smartphones, we don't have electricity, but we have our own technologies, knowledge, and traditional know-how, and it is shared by all indigenous people. They represent 500 million people in the world, but they protect over 80% of biodiversity globally. Now we live in forests, savannas, in small islands, everywhere. Now, living in harmony with nature has enabled us to create this traditional knowledge that we've used for millennia, and that has enabled us to resist, to be resilient, to live, to adapt to all the impacts of climate change. Let me give you an example. Maybe when you get up in the morning, and it happened to me, but when I arrived here, I looked at the weather forecast immediately, and I saw, okay, it's going to be sunny. When I come out of the train, I thought, well, okay, there is sun, very nice. And 7 minutes later, it was raining. And in the weather forecast yesterday, they were saying that it would be sunny all day. Now, in our communities, we don't have smartphones that are going to give us maybe true or false information about the weather, but we have traditional weather forecasts just by looking at nature. My grandmother can forecast when it's going to rain in 1 hour, in 2 hours, or in 1 month. She looks at the way insects are moving, the way birds are flying. She looks at the position of stars. There are millions of them in the sky, but she looks at the position of special stars. Or she looks at flowers on plants. We look at animals. We look at their behavior. If, for instance, the rain season is coming, we look at oxes. They go to sleep and they never put their head on the soil. They put their head in front of the south and up because they are trying to sniff the wind. And we know that the rain season is going to come in 3 weeks. Now, what technology is able to tell us as much as the behavior of animals? We studied our own technologies for millennia by living in harmony with nature. We don't have doctorates or professorships. We don't necessarily speak English, French, or Arabic, but we're experts about nature, and this knowledge is very precious for the survival of humankind. Women play a very important role in the fight in favor of the environment with Jane Goodall, Greta Thunberg, and others. We've seen in various studies that countries which have many women in their governments usually have a small climate footprint, and in agricultural programs they are more likely to innovate. Delphino, you have programs for women that advocate innovation. Yes, well, I represent the French government, and I'm going to express the point of view of the government, but also of international organizations in favor of the fight against climate change. So this idea up here of integrating gender equality in climate negotiations, and it's quite recent, and France was a leader in this integration, in this inclusion. Now, it means many different things. It means training climate negotiators at COP21, the Paris COP, the COP25 in Madrid next year, COP26 in Glasgow. All the COPs don't necessarily take into account the impact of the decisions taken to fight climate change, what we call climate funding, dedicated to countries in the south in particular. They don't take into account the impact of gender equality enough. So the idea of training climate negotiators comes from this. France and Canada are doing it. You don't have enough people, enough women around the table. If I take the example of COP21, 8% of women were representing heads of states and government. Last year it was 37%. It's not too bad, but it's not yet parity. And we also need to have feminist organizations in the field, typically like the one created by Hindu, help them have access to climate funding. There are funding specialized on climate and on feminist organizations, and what we want to do is promote investments on climate that makes gender equality progress by choosing criteria. Regarding the training of climate negotiators, France and Canada organized workshops, training courses for African negotiators in 13 African countries. They are French-speaking countries, actually. There are women that will be able to negotiate for their country during the next COP, and they have been given tools to speak in public, with form ties between the various climate negotiators. We've given them tools to get to know about the negotiations frameworks. It's highly technical. It's the UN Framework Convention against climate change, and we want to make sure that women in the field, like your grandmother and yourself, Indu, but also women taking decisions, should be present around the table and have their voices heard. Marie Leroy, you saw that in the field, the more we help women, the more equality there is, the more resilience there is, and the fewer number of conflicts there are, which is a virtuous circle. You saw that in Bangladesh, I think. Yes, it's important to forget this narrative about women as victims of climate change and really position them as actors of change. They are in the best position to propose solutions because, as Delphine was saying, they produce most of the food in the world. They are in the best position to see environmental degradations, transformations in nature, but they are prevented to play this role by lack of access to financial resources, lack of training. They have no part in the decision-making processes at international level. Now, maybe at very local level in communities and villages, it is not the case, but Indu can maybe witness, give her testimony. I worked a lot in Asia and Bangladesh in particular, and many women don't come to the village councils because they don't feel that they are legitimate, they are not invited, and those who are there are not heard. We heard that a woman who had expressed herself at a village council could not marry because she's not docile enough and soft enough, and that she's a rebel. So our work at CARE is to manage to really give value to these ancestral know-hows and not replace them with scientific knowledge, and give power to these women so that they can take intelligent decisions, help them develop their skills, give them confidence through training workshops so that they can become actors of change. Marie described the cultural, religious, or local barriers that prevent women from being at the decision-making table. There are also legislative barriers in a number of countries in the world. Women are not allowed to own land. They produce food, but they don't own the land. And we observe that in a number of countries, when the land becomes dry because of climate change, men leave for better lands and women remain stuck on the dry lands. And there are a number of programs by the French Development Agency or local NGOs funded by French companies that work with the states to overcome these legislative obstacles, to authorize women to own land and to give them resources to create agricultural cooperatives, micro companies if you'd like, with loans, training them to do agricultural techniques and to enable them to have a resilient agriculture that respects the environment.
Je suis désolée.
I'm sorry, because this is a topic about which I feel very passionate. Indu Imrim, I would like to conclude with you. I quote you at the UN you gave, at UNESCO you gave a speech, and you said that the COVID crisis gave us hope because we've realized the importance of living together, and we know that we depend on each other. And if people are intelligent, they will take heed of this. Do you have hope that that people are intelligent? Yes, I think that the world is intelligent, and what gives me hope is when I look at all these women in my community who have nothing but are heroines. They get up in the morning, they find things to eat and something to drink. These heroines are there. They have nothing, but they give hope. What also gives me hope is international solidarity that can be naturally created. We've seen this with COVID. Because people in cities are happy to just know the names of their neighbors. I was in Paris, so I saw this. And what about what's happening in neighboring countries? And so, people want to go out to parks, etc. So if they knew the value of the environment, they would protect ecosystems, and that would give us more hope. I know we don't have time, but I do want to say, when we begin to talk about the impacts of climate change, it's very easy to say, okay, talk to us about the impact of climate change. But ultimately, what are we awaiting? We just have people who sympathize with us, but we don't want their sympathy. We need empathy. We want people to understand what we are living through and put themselves in our shoes, and so that they will begin to act. Thank you. And when I say that they have to act, I don't mean that we have to wait for the government to take a position to say, okay, we're going to invest 5 million in climate change. We will never see the results. But act so they stop all the fossil fuels you have in your countries, all the coal here. Act so renewables become accessible, because there's inequality in developing countries, but also in developed countries. Make these renewables accessible to everyone, and that's what's going to help with climate change. It's not just by pitying people that we're going to bring about change. It's by taking individual actions and collective actions, by putting financial and technological resources, which we have all within reach. We have to act for my community and other indigenous people who have traditional knowledge that can help extricate us from this environmental crisis and will feed us. Who's going to put food on your table in the morning? The food from the supermarket doesn't just show up by magic, it comes from the land. We owe a lot to the earth. The earth is respected by my people. It has to be respected by all people on this planet in order to have an impact on climate change.
Merci infiniment.
Thank you very much. I thank you so much, Indu Imheim, Barbara Hendricks, who is known throughout the world and who is an indefatigable fighter for refugees, with Celine Schmidt. And I will show you some footage from Ina about the singer Myriam Makeba. That will be our conclusion.
Merci beaucoup. Autant pour moi, excusez-moi, on ne passe pas.
Well, it doesn't seem the video is coming up. Barbara Hendricks.
Et Céline Schmidt.
And Celine Schmidt. Thank you very much, Barbara Hendricks, for being with us. You are a committed, engaged singer, and we've just seen the photo of Myriam Makeba. You have put your voice and your art to the service of oppressed people. You are a lifetime representative of the High Commissioner for Refugees. You've met refugees in Cambodia, Rwanda, and recently in Greece. The displaced number of displaced persons have never been so numerous, 80 million. You are here to talk about the voice of women. I will let Céline Schmidt, who is the spokesperson for a French organization, conduct this interview. Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. Indeed, Barbara, you have been engaged with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees for over 20 years. You've met men, women, and children who've been uprooted, refugees in many countries. You've heard their stories. You've thought together with us to find solutions. And today, 1% of mankind is displaced due to persecution. What helps you maintain hope? Well, first of all, maybe it's by nature. I like to be positive. I am positive by nature. But what has really inspired me to begin this work with the UNHCR is that I was born in the United States in the period of apartheid in the south of Arkansas under the Jim Crow laws. I was a witness to the struggle waged by Martin Luther King that was supported by many women who are not well known. Their names are not well known. But if you look at the photos of Martin Luther King, when he says, "I have a dream in Washington," there is a woman who is right beside him on the photo. It's Dorothy Height. And she's among many women who supported this movement. And without her, Martin Luther King would never have been able to get to Washington and make that speech. So this is something that has inspired me a great deal as a teenager. I was then at university, and I began to fight for women's rights, but then I fought against the war in Vietnam. And at one point I said that everyone's fighting for rights, but perhaps we could find a way to fight for everyone's rights together. And this is something I understood when I received a copy, my first time I worked as an ambassador, when I received the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The first article of this Universal Declaration for Human Rights, it was adopted and proclaimed in the year of my birth. And for me, that declaration was like my twin. And I have the impression that I was born 20 days earlier, when my parents and grandparents were not at all aware of the fact that the first article said that all beings are born equally in their dignity and their rights. And when Leo DeViccio asked me in 1997 to come and work as one of the first ambassadors of the UNHCR, I found a way of implementing this idea that I had learned as a child and as a teenager, and that is to work and to fight for human rights of all. And to me, that had to be the fundamental element of my existence. And I think that the work done by the UNHCR for refugees was a way for me to act on the belief I had on the importance of human rights. So, if we are working together, we don't have to work each in our own little corner for only our rights. That's why I began that work as an ambassador. And it was my colleagues in the field who inspire me a great deal. They're in the field now. They risk their lives to be there. I have lost some close friends who died in service to serve refugees and human rights. But it was especially the refugees I met who don't give me the right not to have hope, especially women, because 80% of all refugees are women and children. And every time I get someone discouraged, I just need to remember the faces of these courageous women, women who have a great deal of dignity, women I have met over almost 35 years of this work. And there was one who really touched me. I was in Tanzania. That was just after the Rwandan genocide. I was in a center for children. It was a malnutrition center for children. There was a woman sitting on the floor with a baby whom she was nursing, and another child who was a bit bigger. And I think this child, who was about 4 or 5 years old, but who looked like she was 2 years old and was dying because the mother could no longer force the child to eat. And doctors explained to me that it is not the one who is strongest who will survive. It's those who have lost the light in their eyes. They're the ones who will die. So I looked into the face of this woman and I realized that the child would die. But she had a child on her breast and she was feeding that child. So she could not give in to despair because she had to save that child. And the face of that woman still haunts me and doesn't allow me to give up hope. That's why I keep hope every day. Thank you very much, Barbara. You spoke of women who are refugees, whom you met today. The COVID-19 pandemic has, of course, had an impact throughout the world. But again, we see an impact, one more impact on women, additional challenges for women and young girls. To your mind, what are the solutions to protect these women and young girls, to enable them to be actors and to participate in the building of tomorrow, of the future? Well, we know that this pandemic had made all solutions and assistance to refugees even more difficult, especially for women and young girls, because even prior to the pandemic, education was something difficult to access for young women. We also talked about sexual violence as a weapon of war, but there's another weapon, that is preventing young girls from getting an education. That's another weapon used against women, and especially young refugee women. So we have to do everything in our power to help them, because when there's a bit of money to pay for education, it's always the boy in the family who would be sent to school. So I think at UNHCR it's important to really target our efforts on young women, because education is a weapon to counter violence and war, and every woman has the right to get an education. Here again, your message in this respect is that each and every person can do something. Decision makers, citizens today in this room, and also people following us on live streaming, young girls, children, women. You're an inspiration for many women, what would you like to tell these young girls? What do you want them to hear from you? Well, I would like to say, when I talked about my childhood, that at the age of 14, a law was passed in the US that gave me the right to vote. And I considered, first of all, that it was huge that I would be considered as a full-fledged citizen, not just because I had received these rights, but because I had been given this responsibility as a citizen, a civic duty. This civic duty is what frees me, means that I'm an actor in this liberation, to do my homework as a citizen. So I think for all young women who are listening to me today, you have something to do. You have a duty. Freedom is not something that is given. It is earned with each generation that passes. And I think that this is something that is exciting. It's fantastic, especially when women work together. It's just fantastic to know that we are doing something and that we will leave a legacy behind us. What influenced me, I believe, is, well, my mother. My father was a pastor. My mother was a teacher. She said, you must never be dependent on a man. You must always be able to take care of yourself without a man. I have nothing against men. I like them, but the president had said, it's true, I love you. There's no issue. But we can be independent. We don't need to push men away. But I think all of society is stronger when men have a place at the table, but women as well. So we have to be at the table as well. We have to be on the menu. You have the courage to do this. And anyway, it's fun. We can have fun. When we're working together, we have a sisterhood, and that's stronger than anything. So I'm telling you, we have to get organized. You have to do what you can do where you are and with the means at your disposal. And you will be able to correct all the stupid things that my generation wasn't able to correct. I have great hope. I've placed great hope in you. I am a grandmother. I have 3 grandchildren. They're boys. They need you to be strong, to continue to be strong and fight, because we will succeed. Thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you for this message of hope. I believe it's important at the end of this afternoon that we keep this message of hope. It's a message for everyone that we all can act, and we hope to be able to continue to work on amazing projects with you. Your help is indispensable. We have challenges to rise to, and we will continue to work together. So we thank you for that, and we thank all of you for having welcomed us here. I would like to thank everyone here, first of all, for the invitation. I would also like to thank all the public in Normandy that always welcomes me so warmly here in Normandy. And I want to thank you for the invitation to participate in this Normandy Forum, to be together, to have an exchange of our ideas. We are not alone, we need each other, and this is a time when we need to draw inspiration and energy from each other. So I would like to thank you, Mr. President, for this invitation. I want to thank Barbara Hendricks and Celine Schmidt for their advocacy for women and calling us to take action. I thank you for everything this afternoon. I want to thank the speakers as well as spectators. On behalf of the magazine ELLE, I want to thank the Normandy region for your warm welcome. Thank you.